I'm Tim Ventura, and we're joined today by Lynn Mattice, President and founder of the National Economic Security Alliance. Mr. Mattice is the Managing Director of Mattice and Associates, a fellow at the Institute for Strategic Risk Management, a senior fellow at Auburn University Center for Cyber and Homeland Security, a distinguished fellow at the Ponemon Institute, and chairman emeritus at the National Intellectual Property Law Institute. He also served on the Inaugural Advisory Board for the National Counterintelligence Center and was one of the lead private sector chairs on the Presidential Taskforce that created the National Industrial Security Program under President George H.W. Bush. Mr. Mattice has previously served in senior executive positions at three major global corporations and authored numerous articles on a wide range of policy-related topics, and is the recipient of numerous awards and citations from government and the private sector. So Lynn, welcome, sir. Thank you so much for your time. Let me thank you not only for your time, but also for your career of public service. I'd like to start out by asking, what is the mission of the National Economic Security Alliance, and what inspired you to found this organization?
Well, the mission is really quite simple. It's about educating policy leaders at the federal, state, and local levels, business leaders, and the general public on issues that impact the economic security of our country. And the other portion of the mission is research into issues affecting the economic security so we can use that in the education process.
Okay. Well, now on the website, I wanted to get into some of the key elements of this. You list the annual report to Congress on foreign economic collection and industrial espionage. So the first version of this report, this was published back in 1995 by the National Counterintelligence Center. And back then, it identified 8 nations that were, quote unquote, actively and aggressively stealing American intellectual property and trade secrets. So it seems like, in terms of economic security, in terms of all of these infringement issues and intellectual property theft, this has been going on for a very long time. Can you help me understand kind of the history of that?
Well, sure. It actually went on long before that, which was the impetus for the creation of the reports and a portion of the reason why the National Counterintelligence Center was initially established in Langley at the CIA headquarters. Remember, we had the Year of the Spy with Alder James and a number of others that had precipitated theft of highly classified, sensitive information about the government, its actions, and how they dealt with issues around the world, giving them to our adversaries. But it wasn't just that; it was friends and foe that were very heavily involved in stealing. If you go back even further, you may recall things like the Japanese having stolen IBM technology relative to specific chips, that they had actually had some errors in the design documents, and those exact same errors showed up in the Japanese chips. And then there was an attempt by the Japanese to steal technology related to the propulsion systems on our nuclear submarines. So that was some of the impetus back then. You wanted to talk about the mission. One of the reasons that we ultimately started this, we'll come back to in 2012 when we formed the organization. But in 2008, when that first report came out, and I was involved in editing it and reviewing it as a member of the Inaugural Advisory Board at the National Counterintelligence Center, which today, by the way, has morphed into the organization called the National Counterintelligence and Security Center.
Oh, okay.
And as a result of that report, at the same time, I was sitting on the board of directors of the National Intellectual Property Law Institute, which I ultimately became chairman and chairman emeritus, and I'm not a lawyer, so that's at least there's one check that's not against me. And so we talked with a number of the different agencies that would be involved in enforcement of economic espionage, and we found from talking with them that there really wasn't any enforcement mechanisms that were really effective for the government to use in these types of situations. So at the time, I went over to see the president of the National Intellectual Property Law Institute, Professor Chandler, who is probably one of the top experts in the world on intellectual property law and constitutional law. And so we started discussing what the issue was, and he went to work and started drafting potential legislation that we worked with the FBI, the Department of Justice leads, some senior folks in the Senate and the House, as well as a broad range of folks across various industry segments, and refined a draft that probably the last time we'll ever see this happen went to Congress, and it passed in the House and in the Senate in one session.
Okay.
Unanimously, I might add. And so fast forwarding, what happened then is those laws were put in place, and each year the National Counterintelligence Center put out reports on economic espionage, as was required by Congress in their funding documents. So as these reports evolved, we saw an alarming trend of the number of countries being named as either friends or foe that were actively and aggressively stealing technology from the United States, let alone state secrets, continued to escalate. So in 2011, when the last report was issued, the government came out and said that they were aware of over 140 countries that were actively and aggressively stealing technology from the United States. And so I dug into that to find out, well, how is that possible? We put these laws in place. We had the National Economic Espionage Act and we had the National Trade Secrets Act, both passed in 1996. Here it's 2011, and it's escalated to now over 140 countries that are actively and aggressively stealing technology. So when you look at that as an issue, one steps back perplexed and say, how can that be? Well, it's pretty simple. There's always been a big push in government that the United States government will not have an industrial policy. And as a result of that, Department of Justice felt it's not their job. And so for that entire period of time, 14, 15 years, they'd only prosecuted 11 cases. So there's no downside. And let's remember in 2011, I think there were only 190 countries in the world. It's evolved since then. We've got a lot of countries that have split up and added. But we have over 140 of the 190 countries. It's pretty clear that, it's a free-for-all.
Yeah, I was going to use the word free for all. And so one of the other things that was mentioned in that report, that was the 2011 report. So there was an estimate that reduced the American GDP by over $20 trillion, if that's accurate.
Well, that actually wasn't in the report. That was in the study that we did,
Okay.
looked at during that period of time. And we utilized that as government failures that resulted in over a $20 trillion loss of GDP to our country, simply because they failed to exercise any fiduciary responsibility over our economy. The only thing they seem to know how to do in Congress is spend and spend and spend. And there apparently isn't any connection with the fact that if you don't support your business community, then you don't have jobs and you don't have people paying taxes. And if you don't support the underbelly of our economy and have people working, we have the kind of situation that we see happening today. And we've got somewhere in the area of 7 million people that's estimated that just have decided not to go into the workforce again. And you can't just give money away and expect people are going to have any kind of desire to go out and work. So that creates a huge issue for us as a country. And some of the countries, like take France for instance, the DGSE, which is their intelligence branch, has an entire structured program of teaching their agents how to conduct industrial espionage. And the head of the DGSE's, former heads of DGSE, have very bluntly said, it's one thing to be an ally when it comes to national security. It's another thing to compete on an economic security standpoint. And the countries like France that have a somewhat of an industrial policy go out of their way to do things to facilitate support for their industries. And our government doesn't do that. Our government, just leaves it in the hands of the private sector. But what we should be doing is really widely and actively briefing our executives and doing everything in our power to, number one, tell them about what's going on and making them aware. I think organizations like the SEC should have requirements in place that then require companies to quantify their losses of intellectual property so that they're responsible. We're doing that with cyber when they have cyber attacks. Now this SEC is requiring them to put some kind of economic number on it. And now, why wouldn't we do the same thing with intellectual property losses? Because without intellectual property, there is no basis for their economic development, their economic growth.
Yeah, well, and intellectual property gives us our businesses a competitive advantage. And so when I looked at the $20 trillion estimate, that seemed to me like I imagine that that's primarily direct costs, right? So for
Right.
instance, like the solar industry, as I understand things, that has primarily gone to China and it's based on American technology, right? And so those are dollars lost because they're being spent through foreign companies as opposed to being spent domestically on the same product. But one thing that occurred to me is um, these companies have to compete against these foreign companies. And so that means advertising dollars, it means sales and marketing personnel, it means a lot of associated and tertiary costs, right? So that $20 trillion estimate could be much higher. And then it also seems like those foreign countries, um, unfortunately, if they had been putting resources into R&D on their own, they would be producing new and novel technologies that would enrich the world and make it a better place. So it seems like there are a lot of additional associated costs and losses on both sides of the equation that may not be accounted for.
Well, yeah, and if you look at, even the UN, the World Intellectual Property Organization, the WIPO as it's known, has a philosophy of developing nations should be able to just take the technology and utilize it without having to pay for it so that they can develop their economies. Um, what is the premise behind, democracy and freedom and opportunity? But if you look at our Constitution, it specifically addresses that the United States government will protect these types of information for enterprises in our economy so that our economy will flourish. If you look back, um, we were a country that was primarily focused on a agricultural base for our society. That was our economic growth model back at the beginning of our country. And then we evolved. And frankly, a good portion of that evolution came from us stealing intellectual property from other places in the world. Um, but that was the foundation of getting things going. But then we created the Patent and Trademark Office and copyrights and things of that nature to protect the intellectual property of individuals who are innovating so that they had an opportunity to benefit from their creations. And it's about the economic development. It's about the opportunity to benefit, to have your families strive and survive and thrive. And so that basic premise is what our country is founded on, and yet our government generally turns a blind eye to that. In the past, we're starting to get some movement. Bill Evanina, who was the director of the National Counterintelligence Center under the Obama administration and under the Trump administration, I sat down with him one day and gave him the briefing while he was still under the Obama administration on the whole structure of the $20 trillion GDP loss, and highlighting a number of broad issues that were involved with that. And he asked to keep a copy of it, but he told me bluntly that he was not allowed to go out and brief businesses and universities about these problems. And remember, at this time, we started to see a massive growth of Confucius Institutes and a broad range of attacks from the Chinese government on stealing intellectual property from every type of methodology that we know of, from the whole espionage standpoint. They use the playbook.
And it is one of the things that interests me is America. I think arguably Americans are very defense oriented, right? We're a first world nation. We try and look out for the rest of the world. We also look out for ourselves. The United States spends more on defense than the next 9 countries combined, but all of that spending is focused on protecting ourselves from conventional attacks, right? So, we recognize that Russia and China are military rivals. We recognize that there's a potential threat there. We are more than willing to spend the money to defend ourselves from that. But then economically, it appears that we've left ourselves as a very soft target. That seems to be what you're saying.
No, absolutely. And again, going back to Bill Evanina, as a result of that briefing, he kept the copy that I'd given him. And when the new administration came in, he went and briefed the vice president and the president on it, and was given the authority to go out and do briefings, including giving 1-day top secret clearances to CEOs and presidents of universities. During the remaining 4 years of his tenure as a director of the National Counterintelligence Center, he did yeoman work, having briefed over 1,000 CEOs and over 100 presidents of universities that had top research institutes. And as a result of that, we've seen some dramatic changes starting to occur. And we saw things like the Confucius Institutes being closed down. We saw the universities starting to send back money to Huawei and some of the other Chinese companies that were involved.
I did want to ask about decoupling. This is something that Nick Mattice and I, we've done a couple of interviews. The first one we did a couple of years ago. And again, decoupling was something that was starting to get more press attention at the time. It was starting to become a popular idea. If nothing else, just because politically, there's some instabilities there. And companies were starting to say, hey, the majority of our manufacturing is coming from a country that we're not sure about the relationship with. So it seems like this is actually speeding up. In September, Bain published an article suggesting that US-China decoupling is increasing. Is that a silver lining? Does that say that things are going in the right direction? Not to say that we, again, not to China bash, not to say that we need to get away from them, but to say we need more options. We need to spread out our manufacturing so we're not so reliant on a single source.
Well, understand that the Chinese goal by 2025 is to not buy a single thing made by a foreign company. Okay. They don't intend to have any foreign companies operating within China by 2025. That's their goal. Okay. So one of the things that we've been looking into, and we've talked with a lot of folks about, and we've been pushing for some time, for years actually, is why are we not focused on Central and South America? Think of the fact that the populations, particularly Latino populations, are very religious and very family focused. They want to stay where their family is. They only come here because they need that economic opportunity to support their family back home. That's their primary reason. What would happen if we pull everything out of China and put it into Central and South America as our closest trading partners and a very short supply chain, and think of the ramifications that can have from an economic stability standpoint in their own countries? Do you think we would have the kind of mass migration into our country that's been taking place the 5 million estimated people over the last year and a half that have come across our secure border, as our government
Well,
keeps telling us about?
yeah,
No,
actually,
they
that
can
that
stay home and they can work and support their families in their home environment. They would much rather do that. And think of what we could do as an economic power if we could get the entire Western Hemisphere as a free trade zone.
yeah, yeah, actually, it seems like a really compelling idea. I'm also thinking offhand, it seems like that may also help reduce some of the influence of the cartels and provide a stabilizing influence on the economy in
Absolutely.
South America as well, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Because the people would say, look, we want a stable life here. We don't want all this chaos that takes place with these cartels. And if we had a secure border and we had immigration reform, which, I frankly, I had sent messages to Senator Manchin on this last go around where he finally was convinced to sign on to the improperly named Inflation Reduction Act, because the only thing it does is hyperinflation as a result of spending another $1 trillion or near another $1 trillion. But the end of the day, what I said to him is, remember what happened to Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan agreed to amnesty for a few million immigrants who had lived here for a number of years. But he said the condition was that we had to secure the southern border and we had to do immigration reform. And the Democratic Congress said, absolutely, we'll do that. And it never happened. So I said to Senator Manchin in my message, make sure if you've got this bill that you want approved to be able to fast track pipelines and refineries and things of that nature, that you get that bill done first. Remember what happened to Ronald Reagan. He didn't do that. He agreed with them that they would do what they say they were going to do. He trusted them. And what's happened? His bill on fast track has never gotten out of committee.
Ah, okay, okay.
Okay? So he's got egg on his face. He's got to feel really upset with the fact that they stuck it to him only to convince him to give them his vote, which was the deciding vote on that whole bill.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay?
Now, these options, again, decoupling and shortening our supply chains by leveraging South and Central America, it seems like, um, and again, this is just my view. It seems like if we're able to at least demonstrate to China, and I guess the same might apply in terms of fuel with Russia. If we're able to demonstrate that we have other options, then it encourages them to play by the rules, right? That would be the
Well,
hope.
Tim, what I don't understand is, you know, we can't convert from fossil fuel overnight. Okay.
Yes. Yeah, I know.
We've got a crisis in Europe right now because Russia cut them off. Okay. We have the capability here in this country of producing not only all the oil and natural gas that we need, okay, but we could support Europe's need with what they need, and they would have zero reliance on Russia whatsoever.
Well, Lynn, let me thank you so much for your time today. And again, let me thank you for your career of public service. Let me close by asking what comes next for you and how will the NESA be making our country a safer place economically?
Well, we're doing a couple of things. I was very fortunate. Years ago, I was befriended by probably one of the most important patriots in our country, and that's Judge William Webster. And we talked about many of these issues. And in 2012, we formed what originally was called the National Economic Security Grid. And we did it in a nonprofit incubator, which was the National Capital Region organization, community foundation. So in 2019, we formally incorporated, but we had changed our name because people said they didn't understand the whole concept of the grid, which was to go city by city and really focus on making each city a sound and vibrant and a resilient economic force, because That's our, the local GDP and the small businesses is where 85% of our growth comes in this country, and the innovations come from. And so that was our concept. And as we built these cities around the country, we would ultimately form a grid that would
Mm,
then support each other. But it's a challenging concept for a lot of people to grasp. So that's why we changed it to the alliance. So we
okay.
have an alliance across the country to form this kind of an approach and philosophy of protecting the values, protecting the history, protecting our society, because without economic security, you don't have national security. And Judge Webster, who's chairman emeritus still of our board of directors, has many times made a famous quote, that America's economic security is its number one national security issue today and for the foreseeable future. And we've done through his help, we've had access to a lot of senior folks in administrations in the past, and we put together papers that we give briefs to the National Economic Council, the National Security Council, heads of agencies, and even presidents that have gotten our documents. And if you remember back, President Bush 43, George W. Bush, was the first president that you heard come out and say the economic security of our country is the number one national security issue we face. And that was from what work we've been doing. And so we're proud of that. And most presidents have understood that going forward, that's a really critical factor. And so, that's part of our goal. But one of the other things we did is we created a thing we call the William H. Webster Profiles and Leadership Awards. Judge Webster has been serving the nation for over 7 decades. And so we broke down his career in each of the major areas that he's been, and we created an award for each of those areas. So we have one for his military service. We have another for prosecutorial because he was a U.S. attorney. Excuse me. We have another for judiciary because he's a federal judge. We've got the one for law enforcement because he was the 3rd director of the FBI. We have one for the intelligence community because he was the 14th director of the CIA. We have another one for Homeland Security because he was in 2005 appointed by Secretary Chertoff as the second chair of the Homeland Security Advisory Council, which he then continued in that role for the next 15 years under every subsequent secretary, under every administration. And he continues today as chairman emeritus of that group. So he's had a very, very significant impact on America. We're proud to have him participating with us. And so we created this award so we can recognize government leaders that have an impact on economic security of our country. And then next year, we're adding a category called emerging leaders in each of those categories. And we've been quite proud of the fact that we have partners that have joined us to make this, everybody involved wants to make it the most prestigious leadership award in government. So we have, in the defense category, we have the National Defense University as our partner for that award. Prosecutorial, we have the American Bar Association Standing Committee on Law and National Security for that award. We're working on getting one for the judiciary section. For law enforcement, we have the International Association of Chiefs of Police. For the intelligence section, we have the National Intelligence University. And for Homeland Security, we have the Homeland Security Experts Group, which is made up of some of the most senior Homeland Security experts in the country. So we're very proud of what we've accomplished with that. And the whole idea of the emerging leader piece of this is to reach down into each of these organizations and find that next generation leader that's really phenomenal and be able to highlight them and bring them into the mold with all of these other incredible leaders that we've recognized. And then hopefully not only make them a model for others to follow in government, but hopefully have them as mentors to others to help stimulate that kind of thinking. I'll blatantly tell you that one of our biggest challenge, as always, is getting donations to help us support our work. So we'd love to get all the help we can get on that. Our website's www, the number 4, nesa.org. We're a designated 501c3. We're nonpartisan, and we keep it that way. We work very hard about it. We have Democrats and Republicans, former congressmen in both sides that are involved with us, as well as some of the most phenomenal former government leaders that you can imagine that are participating with us.
Wonderful. Lynn, thank you again so much for your time and for your career of service, sir.
Well, thank you. And if you want to do this again at another time, I'd be happy to work with you.
Absolutely.
All right. And thank you so much.